the vampire, the ghoul, the monster. All of these names would be attributed to one man who sent Düsseldorf and its surrounding provinces into complete and utter chaos. This true prophet of destruction would leave carnage in his wake and become one of the most sadistic serial killers to ever live. Peter Kurten was the vampire of Düsseldorf. On May 26, 1883, Peter Kurten was born into a world of extreme poverty, violence, and sexual depravity. The Kürten family, which consisted of 13 children, Peter being the oldest, and the two parents lived in a cramped, one-bedroom apartment in Köln-Mullheim. The family would live in a perpetual state of fear of Peter's father, who was a violent and sadistic alcoholic. Being a moldmaker by trade, he would return home from the local pub after spending a majority of his wages, and he would systematically beat his children to a bloody pulp. Throughout the years, the children would be subjected to horrific violence, being forced on many occasions to watch their father brutally rape their mother. If they refused to watch or cover their eyes at all, they were beaten. As the daily routine of violence wore on, their father's appetite grew more heinous, and he turned his sights onto his young daughters. The father was eventually imprisoned in 1911 for having incestuous relations with his daughters. A few years later, at the age of 9, Peter had made a new friend in the local dog catcher who lived in the same building. However, this man was just as perverted and sadistic as Peter's father. He would go on to teach the young boy not only how to masturbate, but how to horrifically torture dogs and perform acts of bestiality. Where a normal child would have been deeply mortified by the events, Peter rejoiced in the new friendship, and a powerful bond between the two developed. Within the same year, while playing on a raft with two friends, Peter pushed one of the boys into the water. When the other boy jumped in to rescue the drowning child, Peter held both of them under the water until they drowned. Their deaths were classed as a tragic accident. After Peter's initial training from the dog catcher, his depraved sexual urges began to rapidly grow. He moved from assaulting dogs to eventually performing bestiality with sheep. During one of these encounters, Peter had slit the throat of the animal and had a powerful orgasm at the sight of the spurting blood. This would solidify Peter's obsession with blood for years to come. By the age of 16, Peter had taken after his father and started trying to abuse his sisters. After running away from home, he began committing petty crimes, mostly stealing food and clothing, and often gaining short prison sentences. After one lengthy period of incarceration, Peter was left bitter and angry at the way he was treated by the penal system. Upon his release, he formed a relationship and moved in with a masochistic prostitute who fulfilled every depraved sexual fantasy he desired. She was also twice his age. During the same time period, Kürten made his first murderous attack on a young girl while sexually assaulting her. He left the young child for dead in the Grafenberg woods. However, no body was ever found, and the girl most likely survived. He had also now gotten into the habit of setting barns on fire with the hope that there were homeless inside. He would hide in the bushes, trying to hear any screams while he masturbated. Inevitably, more jail time followed, and after each sentence served, Kürten's rage against society increased. It is also noted that Peter would purposely break the prison rules so he could get thrown into solitary confinement. While in there, Peter would submerge himself in his dark, twisted fantasy world, where he would indulge in his pleasures for hours on end. It was May 25th, 1913, and Peter was looking for a house to rob. On that night, Peter broke into an apartment above an alehouse. Upon searching room by room and finding nothing of value, he eventually came across the sleeping 10-year-old Christine Klein. Upon seeing an opportunity to finally fulfill his sadistic urges, Peter stepped into the room, locked the door, and seized the young girl by the neck. Christine would struggle against her attacker for some time before slipping into unconsciousness. After sexually assaulting the child, Peter pulled out a small, razor-sharp pocket knife, lifted the child's head, and slit her throat 5 times. He then simply walked out of the room, locked the door behind him, and went back to his home in Düsseldorf. But Peter had made a dangerous mistake. On his way out of the room, he had dropped his blood-soaked handkerchief which had his initials embroidered onto the fabric. When the family awoke to the tragedy and the police arrived, suspicion immediately fell on the landlord's brother, Otto Klein, who a few nights prior had an argument with the landlord and said he would do something his brother would remember all of his life. In a twisted bit of luck, the landlord's name was Peter Klein. The police believed at the time Otto took the handkerchief prior to the murder to possibly frame his brother. On the following day, Kürten went back to Mullheim and in a cafe opposite the Klein's inn, sat and drank an ice-cold glass of beer and reveled in the event. Peter later remarked that all around him people were discussing the murder, and he said all the horror and indignation did him good. Otto was eventually acquitted on lack of evidence and motive. Peter eventually ended up back in prison for separate crimes. After he was released in 1921, he got married and lived a perfectly happy, normal and respectable life. He ended up finding permanent work in a factory and became very active in trade union circles. However, this was the calm before the storm. In 1925, Peter found his way to Düsseldorf, and in the late evening light, he said, "The sunset was blood red on my return." For Peter, this was an omen and his destiny was clear. No longer finding relief in committing arson and burglary, he succumbed to his dark nature. On the 9th of February 1929, Düsseldorf awoke to find itself in the midst of a gruesome nightmare. The body of 8-year-old Rosa Ohlheiger was found under a hedge and she had been stabbed 13 times and her body was burned. 6 days earlier, Peter approached a Frau Kuhn walking home alone and in one foul swoop went from greeting the young woman to stabbing her 24 times before fleeing the scene. 5 days after the murder of Rosa Ohlheiger, a 45-year-old mechanic was found dead with 20 stab wounds, including several in his head. Peter's sadistic appetite still wasn't quenched after the kill, so he had started to return to the crime scenes where he would pleasure himself. He even admitted to find extreme satisfaction when he set fire to Rosa's young body and reaching a sexual climax at the height of the fire. Shortly after these violent murders, a man simply known as Strasberg was arrested for assaulting 2 women with a noose. Naturally, the police accused Strasberg of the February attacks, and for some reason, he confessed that he was the culprit. After he was sent away to a mental institution, the police would describe Strasberg as a bumbling idiot. In August, however, Peter would prove he was still haunting the streets. On the 21st of the month, 3 people were attacked and stabbed while walking home at night. On the 23rd of August, Peter killed 2 young girls while they were on their way home from the local fair. They'd both been strangled and one was decapitated. The next day, a young woman was approached by a man who offered her sex. When she replied, "I'd rather die," Peter replied, "Die then." He then repeatedly stabbed her and fled the scene. However, surprisingly, she survived the attack and gave a good description to the police. Peter had now completely lost control of his sadistic impulses and in September would savagely rape and beat to death a young girl. In October, he would do the same to a young servant girl, and bludgeoned 2 women with a claw hammer. Düsseldorf was thrown into utter chaos as the murder count continued to rise. As the mass manhunt was underway to hunt down the vampire, Peter had brought Düsseldorf to its knees. Due to the variety of victims and murder methods, the public believed there was more than one killer at large, and nearly 1 million names were handed over to the police as potential suspects. On the 7th of November, Peter would commit his final murder. He killed a 5-year-old girl by strangling and stabbing her 36 times with a pair of scissors. He then sent a map to the local newspaper disclosing the location of where he hid the body. She was later found by a factory wall under some rubble. On the 14th of May 1930, unemployed Maria Budlik left Cologne in order to search for work. On the platform at Düsseldorf station, she was approached by a man who offered to show her a way to a girls' hostel. As she followed the brightly lit Düsseldorf streets with the supposed Good Samaritan, she noticed he started to lead her towards the park. With the vampire on the loose, Maria was feeling anxious and uncomfortable and refused to go any farther. The man got very insistent and notably agitated with her refusal, and while arguing with her, a second man appeared to check on the situation. Clearly showing that the man was being watched, he got upset and intimidated by the newcomer's arrival, and the man from the railway station quickly fled the scene, and Maria Budlik was left alone with her rescuer. The rescuer was Peter Kurten. After the incident, Peter Kurten would take Maria back to his apartment. When she refused to have sex with him, Kurten would insist that he took her someplace safe and away from any potential harm. After luring Maria into the woods, he seized her by the throat and insisted that he could have her. After the assault, Peter would ask Maria if she remembered where he lived. When she convinced him that she couldn't, Peter accompanied her back to the tram station. While there, he noticed a police officer was standing by. As Maria boarded the tram, she did not draw any attention to herself, nor speak to the officer. She would survive the attack and become Peter's downfall. Sometime after the assault, Maria, under hesitation, would lead police to her attacker's apartment. Immediately recognizing it after being let in by the landlady, it was soon revealed to the police that the owner went by the name of Peter Kurten. However, Maria would get a bigger shock than she bargained for. Peter had begun climbing the stairs towards her, and as he recognized Maria, he calmly entered his room and shut the door behind him. A few moments later, he would leave the house with his hat pulled down and escape. Upon realization of his inevitable capture, Peter Kurten confessed to his wife that he was the infamous vampire of Düsseldorf, and he would go on to do something that was against his nature. Peter had told her that there would be a substantial reward for his capture, and not wanting to see her live in shame and be known as the wife of the vampire, he asked her to hand him over to the authorities in hopes she could live the rest of her life in peace. This sign of compassion and love for his wife was the opposite of his nature and would confuse psychologists for years to come. On May 24th, 1930, Miss Kürten told the story to the police and explained she had arranged to meet Peter outside St. Rochus Church at 3 o'clock that afternoon. The whole area had been surrounded with armed police, and 4 officers rushed towards Peter with loaded revolvers. He simply smiled and said, "There is no need to be afraid." He calmly went with the police, and the vampire of Düsseldorf was captured. Now in custody, Peter would speak to psychologist Carl Berg, who would later provide a captivating insight into the mind of Peter Kurten. He would also later write the book The Sadist, which would be the most comprehensive account of Peter's violent career. While under questioning, Kurten's memories of the murders and attacks were admitted with extraordinary clarity, vividness, and detail. While dissecting each individual account, he showed no emotion. However, he had a great sense of gratification at the disturbed faces of the interviewing officers. On April the 13th, 1931, charged with 9 murders and 7 attempted murders, the trial of the vampire of Düsseldorf was underway. In the courtroom, Peter had been locked inside a specially built shoulder-high cage, not only to prevent his escape, but to keep him safe from the distraught families of the victims. Behind the cage and laid out bare were the gruesome exhibits of Peter's activities, from the skulls of his victims and body parts displaying the countless injuries, to the knives, rope, scissors, and hammer he used. While many of the witnesses gave their testimonies, Peter would frequently interrupt and correct them on how the events took place in vivid detail. He even challenged the opinions of the experts due to him believing their accounts were not accurate. The jury took only 1.5 hours to reach a unanimous verdict of guilty on all accounts. The presiding judge interrupted Peter's self-righteous ramblings and sentenced him to death 9 times. Peter Kurten would hold his head high and show no remorse. On July the 2nd, 1932, Peter Kurten was brought into the yard of the prison where a guillotine had been erected to finally put an end to his reign of terror. On his way to the yard, he had asked the prison psychiatrist, "After my head has been chopped off, will I still be able to hear, at least for a moment, the sound of my own blood gushing from the stump of my neck? That would be the pleasure to end all pleasures." Peter Kurten died at the age of 48, with a smile on his face. I'd like to thank you all very much for watching. The case of Peter Kurten has always been one I have found absolutely fascinating, and I'm proud to have shared this story with you. One little extra fact, after the execution, Peter's head actually went missing. It would later turn up in Ripley's Believe It or Not Museum in Wisconsin Dells. You can now find pictures online of his mummified head on display as a morbid curiosity. Now, of course, I would like to all thank you very much for watching and the continued amazing support. I have been Mr. Blank, and you've been watching Beyond the Dark.